Hello everyone. Welcome to Software Testing Expert Talk series. Today we have a guest who has 6+ years of experience in software development and testing in the IT industry so far. Plus, he is handling the role of QA automation lead at one of the most prestigious organizations across the world. He is an experienced software developer in test who has worked in UI, API, contract, and unit testing using frameworks such as Cypress, NUnit, REST Sharp, Supertest, PECT, and 𝐶EST. Lewis likes to share and teach others the fundamentals of testing. Plus, he has also volunteered at Code Club UK, where he has taught programming basics to 9 to 11-year-olds in his past. Not only this much in his introduction. In his spare time, Lewis contributes to open source projects such as Pack.js. Outside his job, he is a runner and a great cyclist who has even cycled from London to Paris. Please join your hands and help me in welcoming Mr. Louis Prescott. Welcome to our show, Louis.
Hi. Thank you for having me.
Today, Louis will talk about how we can do API testing using JavaScript. Let's hear directly from him. Over to you, Louis.
Thank you very much. Just going to share my screen now with you.
Okay.
Just trying to work out which is the best to share. Desktop. Cool. So today we're going to be looking at integration tests with Supertest and Nock. A little bit about me. I had a great introduction there, but currently I'm the QA lead at Sarah Care, who deliver home care in the UK. Before that, I worked at Cancer Research and ASOS. And the subject that I'm going to be talking about today has been published course on Test Automation University. So go there. There's some great instructors. It's all free. It's a great course, and Andrew Jones has done a great job setting that up. So the takeaways from today, hopefully you will take away why integration tests using JavaScript, how to do it using Supertest, and how to use Nock as well for your mocking requirements. So why would you use JavaScript for your API testing? I think is a good question to ask, because often the APIs are built with Java or .NET, so it's not usually the first choice to use JavaScript, but I think there are some reasons which I'll go over now. But yeah, I assume the people tuning in will have that common scenario where the backend is built either using Java or C#. So it'll be interesting to see what the people think about that. So my journey, I've worked with lots of different languages, and I started out in Java writing Selenium tests and also REST assured API tests, and then moved more into the kind of front end space using JavaScript, and then back again to C#, but using obviously my knowledge from Java before. And then recently I was using TypeScript to write Lambda tests, and also React front end, and then Python to write tests around the infrastructure. So I've had experience in lots of different languages, and I think this is quite a common scenario for QAs, is that we adapt, and we adapt to the scenario and the language that is used within our organization. And often we become full stack, but obviously, why do we need to do that? And I think it's kind of what I'm going to come on to in a minute. So back at the start of my journey, I was writing Selenium tests in Java for our application. I was verifying the APIs using Postman, and then I would code in the setup of the data using REST#. So often we still interact with the API, even if it is not directly correlated to the test that we're writing. And God forbid we would be using a JavaScript executor as that little extra to make our tests function. And this brings me on to how I stumbled upon Supertest, because Supertest for me was enabled me to write a wrapper around the APIs that we had, because we have different teams and they all had different dependencies. And so we set up the tests using Supertest for the dependencies. And so that's where I kind of stumbled upon, okay, if I want to write my end-to-end tests using JavaScript in Cypress, how am I going to set up that data in that environment? So again, if we look at the pyramid and what I was saying about being full stack, is now we have a lot of options at all the different levels to use JavaScript or TypeScript if you prefer. So for example, 𝐀𝐠𝐞𝐬𝐭 is written as a wrapper around Node.js, and then our end-to-end tests using Cypress or something like Playwright, and then our integration contract tests, we still need to use the native language for that. But this allows us to kind of hone in our skills and say, okay, I'm going to focus on doing as much as I can in a single language, and that will allow me to cover more without having to learn new things or ultimately do lots of things in lots of different languages. So enough talking about how I stumbled upon this, but let's start looking at what it actually means. So API testing in JavaScript is a great option for us to allow us to, as I said, set up data and also write some cool tests. So a funny story is previous organization, I won't mention the name, had a Java framework which the application had actually moved away from Java and moved to PHP backend and a React front end, but the tests hadn't moved. So we're still maintaining the Java framework, whereas what we should have probably been doing is writing our tests in JavaScript. So there's a lot of migration activities happening, and that's where Supertest came in really handy. So just a brief snapshot of what it looks like. So Supertest has a wrapper around a library called SuperAgent. So it allows us to make these requests and set up our HTTP requests using this very simple outline. So making a GET request, we set up any headers that we need, and then we can chain the assertions directly to that request, which makes it super simple for us to write our tests. And you can see how many lines of code, and it's super simple to read. On the right hand side, we've also got the callback function, which allows us, if we wanted to do some more complex assertions, we could also use that methodology. In this scenario as well, you can, if your backend is also using Node.js, like an Express server or something, you can call the app directly. Or you can also call out to the running service just using the URL.
Okay.
So in this scenario, we would be testing the API integration of the real response. And any dependencies, we can set them up again using maybe the API, or we can make an SQL query perhaps. The other thing that we might want to do, and I'll come on to later, is about using Nock to stub out any third-party dependencies, but completely up to you. So let's just jump into some code now to have a look at what a test would look like. So we've got this test. It's a simple GET request. So the app itself is just a simple Express server. It's, if we pass in the ID of our course, currently it's hard coded, but it will just return us this JSON response. So that is what the app is doing. So the test itself will just import the app and then pass it to the request, do the GET for our specific course, and then we can, because in JavaScript it is a JSON object that we're interacting with, we can directly jump into that object and say, okay, give me the body and then give me the ID that's being returned. So again, it's a great example of how using JavaScript allows us to interact with that JSON object without having to do any conversions or any serialization. So if I run this test now, this is the output, but again, obviously we're using the Mocha framework, so we get everything out of the box from Mocha, and Supertest just runs the test for us. Cool. So I will move on to the Nock side of things. So Nock is a mocking framework which allows us to intercept the request. So again, as I said about potentially if we've got any third parties that you're calling out to, you may want to mock those out. So similar to how we set up in Supertest, we just intercept the URL, we set up the request that we want to intercept, and then we reply with a mocked response. So again, super simple. We can just return with the status code. In this example, it's a text response, and any headers again that we want in that response. On the right-hand side, we've got another example, which is a GET request that has super easy to set up in the scenario. And then we reply, and this time we've got a JSON object which returns a list of results. So this will allow us to, so when you're testing your logic of your API, you may not want to test the integrated environment. Just care about, okay, if I pass in these queries, then what happens in terms of creating that response. So we can just reply with a mock response because we don't care at this point. So this allows us to just test the logic that we are building in our component tests. Also, Nock has this really cool feature, which is in experimental phase at the moment, which allows us to turn the mock off or on. So if we say knock off true in an environment variable, this means that it will use the actual integration. So it allows you to basically write your component test and your integration test as one set of code rather than having two sets of tests. So as I said, this allows us to mock our response, allowing us to write stable and reliable tests. So again, the ability of Nock allows us also to write our tests in inside a component. So say you're building a React front end, this allows you to intercept the request and stabilize your unit tests in that way. So I'm going to show you some code for that as well. So we've got our users this time. So we've got a GET request for users, which isn't inside the current app that we've built. So this means that we've mocked this whole section out. So when we do a GET request to get users, this will reply with this response. And we're using Supertest again to make our request. And you can see this is very similar to what we had before. So now that intercepts that. So you could see from the app that we had before, this only is talking about courses. It's not talking about users. So the Nock test completely mocked it out and has run our test and asserted our response. So that's the power of Nock. So I gave you all the demo as I was going along. So have we got any questions?
Yes, Luis. So I have few questions to ask over why, why one should prefer API testing using JavaScript language.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of different scenarios that you would use it for. One of those being setting up your data for your end-to-end tests. Why wouldn't you create those as tests alongside your end-to-end tests, and then you have that double coverage. So it will allow you to get that feedback on your integration points much quicker. And also, as I was saying earlier about QAs are expected to test in lots of different languages, but if you don't have the experience with that API language that you're being asked to write tests against, JavaScript has an option for you as well. So I think that's another good use case.
All right. So as you called up use cases, so what should be the preferable use cases to start with API testing?
So when you're building an API, at the point where you want to deploy your application to a test environment, or you want to test it locally to test that the configuration that you've built is working, that's the point where you'll start writing your API tests to make sure that what you have deployed, what you have running in a URL scenario, that's where you're going to be hitting your integration tests, and that's where API testing comes in. And the other area is when you're building a front-end application, for example, which calls out to an API. That's where you're going to be writing your integration tests to say, okay, this is how I'm interacting. You might have a function that calls there, and you can call that function, and then obviously you can make sure that your tests call that.
All right. Okay. Coming to next question, Luis. How to decide whether we have to go with API testing rather than traditional functional testing?
Yeah, so for me, it's not a case of weighing up whether you do one or the other. You should be doing both to get that coverage, because API tests offer you that ability to test the granularity of your request. So when you're calling out to it, you can test the different authorizations, you can test the different request types and the HTTP responses. So this allows you to get that feedback. And then the functional side of things would just be a higher level test, which tests, okay, when I'm calling from this client, I want this response to happen. So you're looking at, okay, there's a date field, and you want to make sure that the date can't be called with a specific time or whatever. So that's for me. You'd have different scenarios in different circumstances, whether you would use that at the API level or you would use that at the functional level.
All right, got it. Coming to next question, Luis. So what are the different frameworks available for performing API testing with JavaScript?
Yeah, so there's a few out there. Obviously, you can use any of the HTTP wrappers that exist within JavaScript, such as Axios or Fetch, anything like that. There's no reason why you can't use those, and then use something like Jest or Mocha to do your assertions and create your test framework. But yeah, that's where Supertest comes in, because it has all that built in. So yeah, I think there's obviously other things out there in the market as well, but those are the ones that I'm kind of aware of.
All right. Okay. What kind of test failures we generally see while performing API testing?
Yeah, so I think it's a really common thing where you're not sure when you're calling your API and you get a bad request, or you get a 500, for example. You're not sure whether that's due to the test or to the API itself. So I think you want to be super sure when you are calling out to your API that the authorization, for example, is being set up correctly. You want to check that any logic that you're putting inside the test, such as any fake data or any data which relies on unique identifiers, anything like that, you want to make sure that that's being set up correctly within your test. And that's where, when I was talking earlier about, we created a wrapper of the API data, that has tests. So the test data setup has tests which verifies all of that stuff, so you don't have to worry about it. So that's the kind of thing where it's like, how much do you need to test the tests?
All right. Yeah, that's true. Okay, coming to next question. So how one can perform API testing parallelly when a particular feature is in development phase?
Yeah, so it's a really great question. So the tactic of that's worked in my experience is creating the contract up front. So I talk a lot about contract testing, and have a Udemy course on it as well. But the idea is that the front end is the consumer, so they're the ones that are consuming that API. So they are the ones that should be defining what should be in that contract. And so once you have that contract defined, then you can write your tests against it. That's where things like Nock come in. So you can write your test using Nock, which has the API contract built in as the reply. And once the second that the API is available, then bam, you take Nock out, or you turn Nock off using the feature, and your API test should be able to run. So that's a really good tactic, I think.
Okay, got it. Coming to next question, Luis. How do we plan API testing in a project?
Yeah, it's a really great question. So from day one that you're building your API, your testing framework should be alongside. And so there's no reason why you can't start writing your tests alongside, as we said, alongside your development. And again, going through what use case fits into that scenario. So when I talked about testing your logic at the component level, that's where you will have a lot of your tests, which will say, okay, in this scenario, if I receive these parameters, then this is how we return the response. And then you have your integration test, which will test from an external input. So making sure that it takes in all the different HTTP requests, and then you will have your kind of traditional functional end-to-end test, which will make sure that it flows through all the way through to the database. So yeah, for me, it's about splitting it up into those three sections, and then making sure that you tackle it in that way. And Spotify come up with the honeycomb model, where you should be testing most of your stuff at the integration level, because integration tests are actually super fast now, which allows you to put a lot of more of your tests at that level, and you get the more confidence, the closer the tests are to how the application is actually going to be used, the more confidence that you have that those tests are actually testing what you want them to. So that's how I would go about planning my API testing.
Great. Okay. So there are a few more questions. So ready for that? So
yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Coming to next question then. Is API testing a black box testing or white box testing? Could you please throw light over it?
So for me, it's kind of gray, because when you're interacting with the API, you know what you will need to pass in, and you also know what you want to expect. And in order to understand how the API behaves, you need to understand the inner workings of how the logic is then returned. So take, for example, when you get a 500 response from the API, that means that the API doesn't know how to deal with it, or the server might be down, or whatever. So at that time, whoever is calling the API needs to be able to deal with that situation. So they also need to know what situations the API returns that response, so to determine whether it should be caught at the API level or it should be caught at the client level. So for me, it should be gray box.
Got it. Okay, got it. Next question. So what should be the learning path for a beginner in API testing?
Yeah, so I spoke about my journey earlier, kind of coming from functional Selenium tests to working with setting up my automation so it was stable through REST and rest assured. So that was a really good journey for me to kind of start that off. But I think for me, the tool that truly bridges that gap is Postman. So Postman offers a super nice interface for you to start interacting with APIs, and also you can store your queries in there, and you can run them using Newman as well. So it's not a purely manual effort. You can automate them straight from Postman. So I think that's a really great option for someone to start out. And then what I would recommend, and what I did as part of building this this course for Test and Automation University, is I built a Express server using Node.js. So if you are familiar with JavaScript, then just go in and build a server and play around with it and work out how it all works in the background. Because I think that's, for me, is I understand now so much more about the different levels of what makes up an API than I would ever understand just from purely looking at a request response scenario. So yeah, that would be my recommendation, is obviously start out with Postman, making those requests, understanding how HTTP requests work, and then delve deeper into how APIs are built. And yeah, obviously using cool tools like Supertest and Nock, you can also make your tests super resilient and make them as intuitive as possible. So mocking also is super important in terms of that hierarchy of tests that we spoke about in the last question, is making sure that you understand, okay, what is the responsibility of the API and what is the responsibility of the client.
Understood. Yeah, that's great suggestion and a recommendation from you. Awesome. Coming to next question, what kind of skill should today's tester have?
It's a really fantastic question, and I do a lot of hiring and I do a lot of work to make sure that the job specs that I'm sending out and also the assessment criteria during the recruitment process highlights a lot of those things of what a QA should have. And for me, what it always comes down to is problem solving and asking questions. So you can learn programming and you can learn how software works, but what is really hard to teach is the problem solving mindset, and someone who truly understands that the best thing to do in understanding software is to ask questions and open questions. So asking, when you're building an API, what do you expect the client to do in this scenario? When you're building an API, what logs do you need to have in order to test this in production? Those kind of questions are imperative to building a strong and a really successful API server. So yeah, for a QA, what I care about, and other people may think differently, but for me, what I really care about is someone that has that intuition to say, okay, I don't know what I know. I don't know what the answer is, for example, but I have the problem solving capability to be able to work it out. And also I will ask as many questions as it takes to fully understand what the application and how it is behaving.
All right, that's a great answer. Coming to next question, Luis, and the final one as well. So your words of wisdom for today's tester.
I don't know if I am experienced and old enough to give wisdom, but words that I guess are used on a very frequent basis are just, how are we going to test this? So as a tester, in any scenario, if you're in a stand-up meeting, if you're in a refinement, if you're in a planning, just ask that question and listen and wait for the response. Silence also is a valid response. But yeah, my words of wisdom are, keep asking and constantly ask, even if you get bored of asking it, how are we going to test this?
Okay, got it. The question is the key, you mean to say?
Yeah, the question is the key. And yeah,
got it. Okay, thanks, Lewis. Finally, we have reached to closure of this wonderful session on API testing presented by you. Anything else you want to share before we wrap up this session?
No, just keep testing, and AI isn't going to take the tester's role, so don't worry about that.
Okay, that's great. That's like eye opener for everyone. uh, Anyways, if anyone wants to reach out to you, then what are the ways for reaching out to you?
Yeah, I'm on Twitter under Prescott. And yeah, I'm active on that. You can check me on LinkedIn under Lewis Prescott. Obviously, check out my course on Test Automation University. I'm in the Slack channels for that. So yeah, a few different ways that you can contact me.
All right. Okay, Lewis, thanks for joining us over STET and sharing your knowledge based on your experience in your tenure in IT industry so far. Hope our audience would have learned a lot of things from your session, and we would be expecting more such deep dive sessions in upcoming days as well. We wish you all the best for upcoming projects on which you're working on, and thanks for being part of our STET journey.
Thank you very much. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you.